Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there is this underlying expectation of, I guess, precision.
Right, yeah. Like it feels like engineering or something.
Exactly. You break your arm, you go to the hospital, and the x-ray shows that stark, jagged white line across the bone.
Oh, sure.
And the doctor just points at the film and says, there it is. That is the problem.
Right. It is completely binary. I mean, you look at the image and the reality of that situation is just indisputable.
Broken or not broken.
Ah.
It is clean, it is objective, and quite frankly, it's really comforting because, well, as human beings, we like things to be visible.
We definitely do.
We like our problems to be perfectly categorized so we know exactly how to treat them.
But then, you step out of the hospital and into the world of international relations and global geopolitics, and suddenly that x-ray machine is just completely broken.
Yeah, or worse, the doctors are looking at the exact same x-ray and somehow diagnosing two completely different diseases.
Exactly. We are looking at a diagnostic landscape between global superpowers that is, honestly, the absolute definition of muddy waters.
Right.
When two massive nations look at one another, they are very rarely seeing a clear, objective reality. I mean, they are seeing a reflection of their own fears, their own historical traumas, and, their own deeply ingrained ideological predispositions.
And that is exactly where we are going today. Welcome to the Deep Dive, everyone. Today, we are taking on a highly specific mission for this custom exploration with you.
It is a big one.
It really is. We're going to unpack the complex, often entirely contradictory, and just deeply fascinating ways the United States and the People's Republic of China view each other right now.
Yeah, and we're moving way past those sensational, click-driven headlines about trade wars and spy balloons.
Right. No clickbait today. Instead, we are going to dig into the foundational perceptions. The actual psychological and structural blueprints that are actively driving global geopolitics.
It is such a vital conversation for you to hear because understanding how these two nations perceive each other's health, so to speak, and intentions, well, that is the key to understanding where the entire 21st century is headed.
Absolutely. And to figure this out, we are not just guessing or throwing out hot takes. We have pulled a massive stack of source material today to guide our conversation.
A really heavy stack.
Oh, yeah. And I want to lay it all out on the table right at the start so you, the listener, know exactly where our information is coming from.
Go for it.
All right. So we are drawing from a piece titled Assessing Chinese Views of United States Decline from the China Leadership Monitor, Spring 2026, Issue 87. And that is written by Czin and Allie Matthias.
Great piece.
We also have public opinion data, specifically the Pew Research Center's Spring 2025 report on United States views of China.
And we are also going to be reading some incredibly revealing excerpts from the 2025 book, Should the World Fear China, by Senior Colonel Zhou.
Yes, that one is absolutely essential. We are also analyzing an academic paper titled, It is Not a Cold War: Competition and Cooperation in United States-China Relations. That one is by Robert S. Ross, published in the China International Strategy Review.
Right.
To understand the historical frameworks at play, we are bringing in Graham Allison's seminal 2015 Atlantic article regarding the Thucydides trap.
A classic.
Furthermore, we are looking at The New Cold War by Hal Brands and John Lewis Gaddis from Foreign Affairs. And finally, to round out the public sentiment side of things, we are looking at a 2025 survey by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, alongside a 2026 YouGov survey on United States-China relations.
That is a lot of ground to cover. But before we jump into that first report, it is worth noting for anyone listening that these documents are highly politically charged.
Oh, definitely.
We are dealing with inherently sensitive content here regarding both American and Chinese domestic issues, governance structures, and foreign policies.
Right, and we should be really clear about our role here.
Exactly. Our job today is not to take a side, and neither of us is endorsing these specific viewpoints or political systems.
Not at all.
Our mission is simply to impartially report on the factual content and the deep-seated perceptions contained within this source material. We want to help you read the geopolitical chessboard exactly as Beijing and Washington see it.
Free from endorsement.
Right, free from endorsement, so you can understand the strategic mindsets at play.
So let's unpack this core mystery. We are going to start with the fundamental thesis of the Chinese perspective, which really revolves around a single massive question.
Which is?
How does the leadership of the People's Republic of China actually assess the United States today? Like, what is their grand diagnosis of American health?
That is the big question.
And if we look at the China Leadership Monitor report by Czin and Allie Matthias, we get a very clear, Very stark answer. They point to a speech given by President Xi Jinping in 2023 to new members of the Central Committee.
Right, and the timing on that publication is really important.
It is. This speech was notably published much later, in January 2025, in the official theoretical journal named Qixi. And in this speech, he painted a very specific picture. He highlighted what he called the stark contrast between the rise of the East and decline of the West.
Yeah, he explicitly contrasted order in China and chaos in the West.
That is a heavy statement.
It is, and the publication venue there, Qixi, is actually a crucial piece of context that we really need to highlight for you.
Oh, okay. Why is that?
Well, Qixi translates to seeking truth. It is not just a daily newspaper meant for the general public, like the People's Daily.
Okay.
It is the official theoretical journal of the Chinese Communist Party. So, when something is published in Qixi, it is meant to guide the ideological and theoretical thinking of party cadres nationwide.
Wow. So it's not just talk.
No, exactly. When we see phrases like the stark contrast between the rise of the East and decline of the West, this isn't just a politician giving a fiery campaign speech to rally some voters.
Right.
This is the leadership formally instructing the bureaucratic and political apparatus on how to view the fundamental trajectory of global history.
So it is essentially the official operating system update for the party leadership.
That is a perfect way to put it.
But what is the actual code running underneath that update?
Yeah.
Because it is really easy for an American audience to hear phrases like chaos in the West and just, brush them off as standard state media rhetoric or political posturing.
Oh, absolutely. People dismiss it all the time.
But the China Leadership Monitor report insists it is much deeper than that. They say this assessment stems from the Chinese Communist Party's Leninist predisposition.
Right. And that is a term that gets thrown around a lot in academic circles, but we really need to define how it functions mechanically in this specific context.
I completely agree, because I think a lot of us hear Leninist and we just immediately picture old black and white footage of the Soviet Union.
Right. The Cold War, bread lines.
Exactly. And then we just kind of move on. But what does a Leninist predisposition actually mean when a modern Chinese strategist is looking at the United States in the 2020s?
Well, to understand the mechanics of this, we have to look back to Vladimir Lenin's writings from around 1916.
Okay, taking it way back.
Yeah. Specifically, his theoretical work positing that imperialism is the highest and ultimately the final stage of capitalism.
Okay, so how does that translate to today?
In this deeply ingrained worldview, capitalist powers aren't just flawed, they are inherently structurally doomed to decay.
So it is terminal.
Exactly. It is baked into their DNA. It is not a matter of if a capitalist superpower will collapse, but when.
Right.
The theory argues that capitalism can act like a hardened shell that might continue to exist in a state of slow decay for a very long period, but its internal contradictions will inevitably tear it apart from the inside out.
Okay, so wait. What kind of internal contradictions are they actually looking for?
They are looking at wealth inequality, the fragmentation of social cohesion, cyclical and increasingly severe economic crises.
Like market crashes.
Yeah, exactly. And the financialization of the economy, where money just moves around without creating tangible industrial value.
I see.
So when Chinese leadership looks at the United States today, they are looking at a blank slate and asking, how is America doing?
Right, they already have the answer.
Exactly. They are looking through a cognitive filter that has already predetermined the outcome. The diagnosis of terminal decay was written a century ago.
That is wild.
They are simply observing the symptoms playing out in real time. And this is exactly why the assessment of United States decline has remained incredibly durable and consistent across entirely different American presidential administrations.
That is such a fascinating lens to look through. So it literally doesn't matter who is sitting in the Oval Office.
Not at all.
It doesn't matter if it is a Democratic administration passing massive trillion-dollar domestic infrastructure bills or a Republican administration aggressively changing global trade paradigms and rewriting tariffs.
No.
To a Leninist observer, those are just different ways a dying system thrashes about. The filter remains exactly the same.
Precisely. And the China Leadership Monitor report actually provides empirical evidence of this ideological filter at work.
Oh, they do?
Yeah. They didn't just read one speech. They traced the academic buzzwords used within Chinese strategic circles.
Okay, what did they find?
They looked at a vast array of Chinese academic journals, policy papers, and state-affiliated newspapers, and they mapped out the frequency of very specific phrases. They tracked spikes in phrases like "great changes unseen in a century" and "the East is rising" and "the West is declining."
And when exactly did those phrases spike?
They absolutely spiked during the 2020 and 2024 United States election cycles.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Whenever there was visible political friction, social unrest, or institutional gridlock in the United States, Chinese academics and state media heavily utilized this terminology.
That is so telling.
They point to American electoral chaos not as a temporary political glitch, but as empirical validation of their long-held Marxist-Leninist theories.
They aren't just looking at the ballot box, though. If you look at the report, they are looking deeply into the structural economy, right down to the kitchen table of the average American family.
Yes, they are.
The report highlights this concept, coined by a prominent Chinese commentator writing under the pseudonym Zhou Yan.
Right.
And the pseudonym itself translates roughly to the party's voice, which tells you how closely aligned these views are with official thinking. But Zhou Yan talks about something called the kill line.
Yes, the kill line. It is a striking term.
It really is.
And it speaks directly to how Chinese analysts interpret the vulnerabilities of American capitalism.
It sounds intensely dramatic. What is the actual mechanism behind the kill line? Like, how does it work in practice?
The kill line is a diagnosis of extreme structural economic fragility hidden beneath the surface of apparent wealth.
Okay.
Zhou Yan argues that American decline isn't just about abject visible poverty. I mean, like people living on the streets, though they certainly point to that. Rather, the kill line describes a widespread state of American existence where financial resilience has been squeezed to the absolute breaking point.
So how does that look for an average family?
The argument goes like this. Millions of American families might technically have jobs, they might own cars, they might buy consumer goods, but they have extremely meager savings and no robust social safety net.
They are living paycheck to paycheck, essentially.
Exactly. They are living right on this invisible kill line. And what this means is that it only takes one single unexpected crisis to push them over the edge.
Like what kind of crisis?
A sudden medical emergency, a major car repair, a brief period of unemployment, or an unexpected illness. Any of those can completely deplete their finances.
Wow.
Because the system is highly financialized and unforgiving, that single crisis can trigger a catastrophic downward spiral into bankruptcy, eviction, and homelessness.
That is a grim picture.
It is. To Chinese analysts like Zhou Yan, this fragility isn't an accident. It is a feature of late-stage capitalism. The kill line is viewed as empirical proof that the American capitalist structure fundamentally fails its citizens by prioritizing corporate profits over basic human security.
You know, that brings me right back to the medical diagnosis metaphor we started with.
How so?
Reading through this assessment in the source material really struck me. The Chinese strategic view of America is like a Monty Python doctor who gives the exact same terminal diagnosis regardless of what symptoms the patient actually presents.
Oh, that is a great analogy. Walk me through that.
Think about it. The patient comes in with a cough. Ah, you are dying of capitalist decay.
Right.
The patient comes in, looks incredibly fit, and runs a 4-minute mile. Ah, the frantic, desperate thrashing of a dying body right before the end.
Exactly.
The authors of the ChinaLeadership Monitor report point out this massive, almost comical contradiction in the text. Look at how Chinese state media interprets American foreign policy.
Yeah.
If the United States decides to pull back, retreat from global alliances, and act isolationist, Chinese media immediately points to it and calls it absolute proof of decline.
Right. They frame withdrawal as weakness.
They say, look, the unipolar hegemony is ending. They can no longer afford to be the world's policeman.
Yes.
But then flip the script. What if the United States acts aggressively?
Right.
Let's say, as the sources note, the military strikes on Iran in 2025, or assertive actions in Venezuela, or Washington launching massive, sweeping export controls on advanced semiconductors to choke off competitors.
Heavy-handed moves.
Exactly. You would think the Chinese analysts would look at that display of raw power and say, okay, maybe they aren't declining.
Right, but they don't.
No, the diagnosis does not change. Chinese media simply describes those active aggressive measures as the violent thrashing of a cornered beast.
A cornered beast. Wow.
They literally claim the United States is suffering from hegemonic anxiety syndrome.
That is the perfect analogy, and it perfectly illustrates the cognitive trap of this worldview.
Yeah.
Because if every single action the United States takes, whether it is strategic retreat or deep global engagement,
Right.
whether it's economic protectionism or expanding military alliances in the Indo-Pacific, if all of that is interpreted as a symptom of the exact same underlying disease, then the Chinese leadership is essentially operating in a hermetically sealed, closed loop of confirmation bias.
A completely closed loop.
The China Leadership Monitor report highlights this dynamic perfectly. When the United States pushes back economically, Chinese officials don't view it as a sign of American strength.
What do they call it?
For example, Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, labeled United States export controls on tech as hegemonic bullying that actually exposes the fact that the United States has lost its confidence and is panicking.
Wait, okay. I am struggling to reconcile this inevitable clash narrative with the reality on the ground.
How so?
We have the state media and the top leadership painting this monolithic, unyielding picture of a dying, hostile American beast. Right.
But if we look at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs survey from 2025, the data tells a completely different story.
It really does.
If the propaganda is so absolute, why isn't the Chinese public fully buying it?
That is the crucial pivot here. We have to separate the realm of elite state propaganda from the nuance of everyday public perception.
Okay.
And you are right. The data from the Chicago Council survey is genuinely surprising, especially for American listeners who might assume China's population is politically monolithic.
Yeah, I think a lot of people assume that.
According to this 2025 survey, which gives us a very rare window into the attitudes of everyday Chinese citizens, a full 61% of the Chinese public wants a dual-pronged approach to the United States.
Okay, wait. What does a dual-pronged approach actually mean in practice for a regular citizen?
It means they want their government to actively balance things. They aren't asking for a capitulation, but they also aren't asking for a Cold War.
That makes sense. The majority of the public wants Beijing to maintain friendly cooperation with the United States while simultaneously taking necessary steps to limit American power when it infringes on Chinese interests.
That sounds incredibly pragmatic.
It is highly pragmatic. It is a nuanced view. It is decidedly not a zero-sum, complete hostility mindset.
Right.
In fact, the survey shows that the Chinese public is actually quite divided on which country is currently stronger economically or militarily. They don't take American decline as absolute gospel truth the way the theoretical journals do.
So what is driving that disconnect? Why is the average person in Shanghai or Shenzhen view America differently than the cadres writing for Kishi?
It comes down to daily lived experience and economic reality.
Okay.
The Chinese public is deeply connected to the global economy. Millions of Chinese Zhous rely on exports to the American market.
Right.
Hundreds of thousands of Chinese families send their children to study at American universities. Despite the internet firewall, there is still massive cultural exchange.
Yeah, you can't block everything.
Exactly. The public sees the resilience of American tech companies, they see American cultural exports, and they recognize that absolute hostility would cause immense economic pain at home.
The sources outline this division really clearly. The readings identify two general competing views within China regarding America. Let's break those down. On one side, you have the realist view.
Yes, the realist view. And this perspective essentially mirrors the official state propaganda we were just discussing.
Okay.
In this framework, America is fundamentally a declining superpower. However, because it is declining, it is terrified of losing its status, and therefore it is desperately trying to maintain its global hegemony by continuing to act as the world's policeman.
So they see America as actively malicious.
From the realist perspective, yes. The United States is actively, intentionally trying to contain China's rise, encircle it with military alliances in the Pacific, and aggressively interfere in what Beijing considers its purely domestic issues.
Like what kind of issues?
Particularly regarding the status of Taiwan and human rights concerns in places like Xinjiang and Hong Kong.
Right.
If you are operating within this realist view, the key vocabulary terms you use are containment, opposing hegemony, and warning that America operates solely from a position of strength.
But then you have the competing perspective, which the sources call the liberal or cooperative view.
Yeah.
And this view is radically different.
It really is.
It argues that America is, in fact, still a vital, robust superpower, and more importantly, that China actually benefits from accepting American superiority in certain global areas.
Yeah, that is a huge departure.
Why? Because the two nations share incredibly deep economic interdependence. They share common security goals in the Asia-Pacific region, like freedom of navigation for commercial shipping and preventing nuclear proliferation.
Right.
This liberal view emphasizes words like harmonious, engagement, and pursuing peace and development.
And what is crucial to understand is that this liberal cooperative view isn't just held by average citizens or dissident academics. No, we can see it championed by highly placed, very influential diplomats within the Chinese system. Yeah. Our source material highlights a fascinating interview with the former Chinese ambassador to the United States, Cui Tiankai.
Oh, Cui Tiankai was a massive figure. He served as ambassador from 2013 all the way to 2021, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
He navigated an incredibly tumultuous period that spanned the Obama, Trump, and early Biden administrations.
He saw a lot.
He saw the trade war initiate firsthand. In his observations, Cui Tiankai noted a fundamental philosophical difference in how the two nations approach global leadership.
Okay, what was his takeaway?
He argued that many policymakers in the United States operate with a deeply ingrained mentality that America must always be the undisputed global leader.
Right, the unipolar moment.
Exactly. And because of that, they view international relations as winner takes all, zero-sum game. If China gets richer, America must be getting poorer. If China gains influence, America must be losing it.
But Cui argues that China doesn't look at it that way.
Right. Cui argued that for China, the ultimate goal isn't to replace the United States as the unipolar hegemon, but to achieve a win-win outcome.
A win-win outcome.
Yes. He emphasized that the Chinese approach to diplomacy and economics does not have to be a zero-sum competition where one nation's gain is automatically the other nation's absolute loss.
Okay.
He envisions a multipolar world where both nations can grow and prosper without having to destroy the other.
I want to lean into that for a second because I was looking at the cultural data in our sources, and it completely shatters this narrative of inevitable total civilizational conflict that we hear from the realists.
Oh, the restaurant data.
Yes. You simply cannot claim that these two countries are destined for a clean, absolute Cold War separation when millions of their citizens are quite literally eating out of each other's cultural takeout boxes every single day.
Fast food diplomacy. It is a brilliant metric for measuring actual societal integration.
It really is.
Yeah.
Look at the data provided in the readings. There are roughly 45,000 Chinese restaurants operating across the United States.
45,000, that is huge.
Right. They are woven into the fabric of almost every single American town, from massive cities to tiny rural communities.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, look at the American cultural footprint inside China. There are over 3,500 McDonald's locations currently operating in China.
Wow.
And even more staggeringly, there are over 6,000 Kentucky Fried Chicken locations.
6,000. It is an incredible statistic, and it speaks to a level of enmeshment that goes far beyond high-level trade deficits, semiconductor tariffs, or tense diplomatic summits.
Right. It is everyday life.
We are talking about the daily lived experiences of millions of people. Those 6,000 Kentucky Fried Chicken locations in China aren't just selling chicken. They represent massive local supply chains.
Exactly.
They employ hundreds of thousands of Chinese workers. They rent local real estate. They use local agricultural products.
Right.
And similarly, those 45,000 Chinese restaurants in the United States are deeply embedded in the American agricultural and commercial economy.
You are literally digesting the other culture on a daily basis.
Exactly. And that economic interdependence fundamentally alters the calculus of conflict.
How so?
It makes the idea of a clean, cold decoupling, which is a buzzword you hear constantly in Washington and Beijing right now, incredibly difficult to actually execute in practical human terms.
It would just hurt too much.
Right. You can decouple a microchip supply chain if you spend enough billions of dollars, but you can't easily decouple the daily habits, jobs, and cultural tastes of over 1 billion combined citizens.
No. You really can't.
The economic pain of a true severance would be catastrophic for everyday people in both nations.
So we have established the complex view from the Chinese side. At the state level, they view the United States as structurally declining, fueled by Leninist ideology.
Right.
But at the public level, there's a nuanced, sometimes highly cooperative view built on pragmatic economic reality and, yes, fried chicken.
Absolutely.
Let's pivot the lens entirely now. Let's hold up the American mirror. If we look at the Pew Research Center data and the YouGov data provided in our stack, how does the United States perceive China? Are Americans buying into the win-win philosophy?
It's in short, no.
Not at all.
The view from the American side is currently marked by profound, escalating anxiety about shifting global power dynamics.
Okay.
The data paints a picture of a public that feels deeply threatened. If we look at the spring 2025 Pew Research Center report, an overwhelming 73% of Americans believe China's influence in the world is getting stronger.
Okay, so they acknowledge the rise, but how do they categorize that rising influence? Is it benign?
Far from it. When asked to categorize the relationship, 56% of Americans view China directly as a competitor.
Yeah.
33% take it a step further and view China as an outright enemy.
Wow.
And only a meager 9% view China as a partner.
9%. That is a staggeringly low number for partnership, especially considering everything we just discussed about our deeply intertwined economies.
It really is low.
We also have a 2026 YouGov survey in the source material that backs up this general sentiment. It shows that only 22% of Americans consider China to be an ally or even friendly, with a mere 5% willing to use the outright term ally. Clearly, the American public isn't focused on the mutual benefits of trade. They sense a profound structural challenge to the established global order that America has led since World War II.
And this American anxiety isn't just a fleeting political mood. It maps perfectly onto a crucial theoretical framework in international relations.
What framework is that?
It is a concept that has dominated strategic thinking in Washington for the last decade. The Thucydides trap.
Oh, yes.
This term was popularized by the Harvard political scientist Graham Allison in a highly influential 2015 article in The Atlantic.
I find this concept absolutely fascinating because it applies ancient history to modern anxiety so cleanly.
It really does.
For the listener who might not have taken a political science seminar recently, let's unpack the actual mechanics of the Thucydides trap. Where does the name come from?
The Thucydides trap is named after the ancient Greek historian and general Thucydides. He is famous for chronicling the Peloponnesian War, the devastating conflict that tore ancient Greece apart in the 5th century BC.
Okay, so Sparta and Athens.
Exactly. When Thucydides analyzed why that war happened, he didn't just look at the immediate trigger events, he looked at the underlying structural stress.
What did you find?
He famously wrote that it was the rapid rise of Athens and the profound fear that this growth instilled in the established power, Sparta, that made war inevitable.
So it is about the psychology of power transitions.
Exactly. Graham Allison took this ancient dynamic and applied it to modern global history. He argues that whenever a rising power threatens to displace an established ruling power, it creates massive structural stress in the international system.
Makes sense.
The rising power feels it deserves more respect, more territory, and more say in the rules of the game because of its new strength.
And the established power.
The established power, meanwhile, feels terrified of losing its position and deeply suspicious of the rising power's intentions.
Right.
Allison's research looked at the last 500 years of history and found 16 cases where a rising power challenged a ruling power.
And what were the results?
In 12 of those 16 cases, the result was a catastrophic war.
Wow. And obviously, in Allison's modern framework, China is the rising Athens, and the United States is the fearful, established Sparta.
Correct. And to illustrate exactly why the United States, our modern Sparta, is feeling such intense anxiety, Allison gives a stark economic quiz to his students at Harvard.
All of his part.
The numbers he uses are breathtaking because they show just how rapidly this power shift has occurred. It hasn't taken centuries. It has happened in a single human lifetime.
Walk us through that quiz, because the numbers in the source text really jump off the page.
All right. Allison asked people to compare the economic weight of China and the United States in the year 1980 versus the year 2014.
Okay, 1980 versus 2014.
In 1980, China's gross domestic product, when measured by purchasing power parity, was just 10% of the United States.
Let me pause you there. We hear gross domestic product a lot, but what is purchasing power parity, and why does Allison use it instead of just normal gross domestic product?
That is an important distinction. Nominal gross domestic product just measures the total value of everything a country produces converted into U.S. dollars at current exchange rates.
Okay.
But exchange rates fluctuate, and things cost different amounts in different countries. Purchasing power parity adjusts for the actual cost of living.
So it is a more accurate reflection of what they can actually do.
Right. It asks, How much actual stuff, how much steel, how much concrete, how many hours of labor, how many ships can a country buy with its money in its own domestic market?
Oh, that is crucial for building a military.
Exactly. For a military and industrial context, purchasing power parity is often a much better measure of a nation's true raw capacity to build and sustain power.
Okay, so going back to the numbers. In 1980, China's economy, in terms of actual purchasing power, was a mere 1/10 the size of America's. They were a blip on the radar.
Right. But by 2014, just 34 years later, China's gross domestic product, by purchasing power parity, had reached 101% of the United States.
Wait, 101%?
Yes. They didn't just catch up. By that specific metric, they marginally surpassed the United States.
That is a staggering velocity of growth.
It is unprecedented.
And it is not just the overall size of the economy. The source material highlights the shift in financial reserves as well.
Oh, the financial reserves data is even more dramatic.
Really?
Yeah. In 1980, China's foreign currency reserves were tiny, just 1/6 the size of America's reserves. They had very little financial cushion.
Right.
But by 2014, China's reserves weren't just larger, they were 28 times larger than America's.
28 times larger, wow.
When an established superpower looks at a statistical trend line like that, the psychological impact is profound. It triggers that exact Spartan fear Thucydides described.
Of course it does.
You look at those numbers and you think, if they keep growing like this, we will be eclipsed and we won't be able to dictate the rules of the international system anymore.
Oh, wait, I am looking at our sources, specifically the critiques of Allison's work, and I have to challenge the inevitability of this Thucydides trap. Okay, let's hear it.
Just because a mathematical trend line goes up on a chart, and just because the gross domestic product numbers are converging, does not mean a catastrophic war is predestined by the laws of physics.
That is a very fair point.
Pointing to the academic readings from our stack, many scholars forcefully disagree with Graham Allison's premise.
What is their primary counter-argument?
Their main critique is that the Thucydides trap theory is overly simplistic because it completely ignores domestic political conditions.
Okay, explain that.
It relies on a structural realist view of the world that treats nation-states like identical billiard balls on a pool table.
Billiard balls, right.
It assumes that if a rising ball gets big enough and rolls fast enough toward an established ball, they are going to crash, based purely on mass and velocity.
Right, just physics.
But states aren't solid billiard balls. You have to look inside the balls. You have to look at their internal politics. Is the Chinese Communist Party of the 2020s the exact same entity with the exact same risk tolerance as the Chinese Communist Party of the 1970s?
Obviously not. Is the United States political leadership a static, unchanging force? No.
That is a highly sophisticated critique. By focusing entirely on external power shifts, the gross domestic product numbers, the military budgets, the Thucydides framework often blinds us to the internal dynamics that actually dictate a country's foreign policy.
Exactly.
And this raises a vital question for you, the listener. If the real danger isn't just a mathematical inevitability of two states colliding, how should the United States actually manage this dynamic?
And this is exactly where the insight from Hal Brands and John Lewis Gaddis in their Foreign Affairs article, The New Cold War, becomes so critical. They completely reframe the nature of the challenge.
How so?
They argue that the ultimate test for the United States in its long-term contest with China isn't just about external metrics. It is not primarily about building more ships in the Chinese Navy or outcompeting Beijing for influence in Africa or winning a specific trade dispute.
What is the ultimate test, then, according to Brands and Gaddis?
They argue that the primary challenge is fundamentally internal.
Internal.
Yes. The true test is the patient, deliberate management of internal threats to American democracy itself.
That is a massive shift in perspective. So, the real trap isn't necessarily Thucydides. It is internal collapse.
Precisely. Brands and Gaddis suggest that in order to endure a multi-decade strategic competition, the United States must learn to tolerate moral and geopolitical contradictions abroad, but most importantly, it must govern itself effectively at home.
Right.
If the United States allows itself to be consumed by deep social fragmentation widening wealth inequalities, extreme political polarization, and the failure of its own democratic institutions, then the United States essentially defeats itself.
The irony there is profound,
Isn't it?
because those internal vulnerabilities, the political gridlock, the social division, those are the exact symptoms that Chinese state media and theoretical journals like Qxi constantly highlight as empirical proof of America's terminal decline.
Exactly. If America tears itself apart from the inside, it simply proves the Leninist diagnosis correct.
Which connects directly back to the Chinese belief in United States decline, and it fundamentally informs China's actual real-world geopolitical behavior.
Right.
This brings us to a major pivot in our deep dive, China's grand strategy.
Let's get into it.
Let's put ourselves in the shoes of the leadership in Beijing. If you are sitting there and you honestly ideologically believe your biggest global rival is structurally collapsing under the weight of its own internal capitalist contradictions, what do?
Yeah, do you launch an attack to finish them off, or do you wait?
Right. That is the ultimate strategic dilemma. And based on our readings, particularly Senior Colonel Zhou's 2025 book, Should the World Fear China?, the strategic consensus in Beijing is overwhelmingly, resolutely focused on patience.
Patience. Let's unpack Senior Colonel Zhou's perspective in detail, because it provides a crucial counter-narrative to the prevailing American fears of an aggressive, expansionist China.
It really does.
Zhou isn't just an academic. He is a retired senior colonel in the People's Liberation Army and a senior fellow at Tsinghua University. He understands the military and strategic mindset intimately.
He is an insider.
He is. And in his book, he argues forcefully that China is not revisionist power.
Revisionist power being the academic term for a country that wants to tear up the current international rules and write new ones that favor themselves.
Correct. Zhou says that term is a purely American label. He argues it is a rhetorical tool designed by Washington to justify containing China, not an accurate description of actual Chinese goals or behavior.
You know, his argument makes a lot of logical sense when you actually step back and look at the macroeconomics.
How so?
Well, why on earth would China want to violently destroy the liberal international order? As Zhou points out, no other country on the planet has benefited more from the current era of globalization than China over the last 4 decades.
That is very true.
They didn't build a parallel economic universe. They integrated deeply into the international regimes established by the West after World War II. They are arguably the single largest beneficiary of institutions like the World Trade Organization and the International Monetary Fund.
It is the ultimate realist calculation.
Exactly. I'll use a casino analogy here.
Okay.
If you are sitting at a blackjack table and you are consistently winning the most chips, you don't suddenly flip the table over, set the casino on fire, and demand everyone play a different game.
No, you don't.
You keep playing the game that's making you rich.
That is a great way to visualize it.
Right.
And the findings from the China Leadership Monitor corroborate this deeply patient, risk-averse approach.
Right.
They note that despite the Chinese Communist Party's persistent ideological assessment that the United States is in terminal decline, this belief has not led to a wildly emboldened, violently confrontational Chinese foreign policy.
No, it hasn't.
Instead, their grand strategy is based on insulation and endurance.
How does that play out tactically?
Well, Chinese officials operate under the judgment that time is fundamentally on their side. If you believe your opponent is dying of an incurable disease, you don't need to risk your own life in a fistfight.
Right. You just wait.
In fact, a declining superpower is viewed by Beijing as highly dangerous, erratic, and prone to lash out militarily to prove it is still strong, what we earlier called hegemonic anxiety syndrome.
Exactly.
Therefore, China's primary goal is to actively avoid provoking the United States into a hot war, insulate the Chinese economy from American sanctions as much as possible, and simply wait while the United States supposedly exhausts itself through internal division and foreign misadventures.
So it is not about flipping the geopolitical chessboard in a sudden rage because you want to play a different game.
Not at all.
It is about quietly, patiently waiting for your opponent to get tired, make unforced errors, and eventually leave the room so you can simply inherit the table without firing a shot.
And we can see this profound restraint reflected in the hard military data that Zhou provides in his book.
Let's look at the data.
If China were genuinely preparing for an imminent global hegemonic war to physically overthrow the United States military across the globe, we would expect to see a massive, unsustainable spike in military spending. They would be moving to a war footing.
Right, you would see it in the budget.
But Zhou highlights that China's military expenditure as a percentage of its overall economy has remained remarkably restrained. It has stayed below 2% of its gross domestic product for decades.
I want to highlight how significant that is, 2%. To put that in perspective for you listening, 2% of gross domestic product is actually below the minimum standard that the United States forcefully demands of its own North Atlantic Treaty Organization allies in Europe.
It is a staggering statistic when you contrast it with the breathless rhetoric we usually hear about a massive Chinese military buildup.
It is.
Now, to be clear, because China's overall gross domestic product is so massive, 2% still equals a huge nominal budget, which allows them to build a highly capable, modernized force focused on regional dominance in the Western Pacific. But they are achieving that area denial capability without matching the United States' massive global spending footprint.
Furthermore, Zhou points out several other structural restraints.
Like what?
For instance, China has no formal first-use nuclear weapons policy. They are the only recognized nuclear weapons state under the Non-Proliferation Treaty to explicitly declare they will not be the first to use nuclear weapons in a conflict.
That is a big deal.
And if you look geographically, they are not seeking to build a vast global network of formal military alliances or a sprawling web of overseas garrisons in the way the Soviet Union did during the Cold War or the way the United States currently does.
Right.
Currently, China only maintains one acknowledged overseas military logistic base, which is located in Djibouti, primarily to support anti-piracy operations in the Gulf of Aden.
All of these data points, the low percentage of gross domestic product spent on defense, the no first use in nuclear policy, the stark lack of a global network of military bases, they all deeply support Zhou's thesis.
They really do.
They suggest that China's rise is aimed at peaceful economic integration and regional security, rather than a strategy of immediate global military domination.
However, we have to ground this theoretical patience in physical reality.
Oh, definitely.
Even if both sides are earnestly trying to play a long game, even if China is patiently waiting for American decline while the United States is focused on internal democratic renewal, we still exist in a physical world where massive, heavily armed militaries are operating in incredibly close proximity on a daily basis.
Which means we have to address the immediate kinetic risks.
Right.
If neither Washington nor Beijing actually wants a planned total war, what could ignite a conflict tomorrow? What are the actual flashpoints that could bypass all this grand strategy?
The most obvious, the most sensitive, and frankly the most dangerous flashpoint is the Taiwan issue. Returning to the Pew Research Center public opinion data, 66% of Americans view the tensions between mainland China and Taiwan as a very important issue to United States national interests.
That is a high percentage.
Because of this anxiety, there is a highly prevalent fear in Western media and political circles of an imminent D-Day-style amphibious assault by the People's Liberation Army on the island.
But Zhou offers a very different and much more measured assessment in his book.
What does he say?
He asserts that leadership in Beijing still views peaceful reunification with Taiwan as entirely possible and, frankly, preferable.
Preferable, right.
He states clearly that there is no indication that Beijing has lost confidence or patience for the peaceful reunification process. And importantly, despite Western anxieties, China has never officially announced a set timetable or deadline for an invasion. The grand strategy of patience still applies to Taiwan.
But there is a massive caveat to that patience.
Right, the absolute red line.
Yes, the one China principle. Zhou makes it clear that as long as Taipei does not make a formal legal declaration of independence, and as long as foreign powers do not formally recognize Taiwan as a sovereign nation, Beijing's structural patience remains intact.
Okay.
But if that red line is crossed, the calculus changes instantly, and war becomes a distinct possibility regardless of economic costs.
Assuming that red line isn't intentionally crossed by politicians, what is the real danger? According to Zhou, and this is echoed by almost every serious strategic analyst in our source material, the most likely trigger for a catastrophic war between the United States and China is not a calculated planned invasion of Taiwan.
No, it's not.
The real danger is an unexpected incident.
An accident. A mistake in the dark.
Precisely. We are talking about a collision in the highly contested waters of the South China Sea or the narrow confines of the Taiwan Strait.
To understand how easily this could happen, we have to look at the physical reality of what are called freedom of navigation operations, or FNOPs.
Okay, let's explain those.
For a listener who might just read that term in a headline, it sounds like a polite diplomatic protest. But physically, it is incredibly tense.
Very tense.
A freedom of navigation operation involves an American naval vessel, usually a guided missile destroyer, deliberately sailing within a few miles of an island or reef that China claims as its sovereign territory.
They are actively challenging the legal claim by physically sailing through the water.
Exactly. And when that American destroyer sails into those waters, the Chinese military doesn't just watch it on radar. They scramble their own warships and fighter jets to aggressively shadow the American vessel.
Wow.
You have heavily armed, multi-thousand-ton warships sailing sometimes just dozens of yards away from each other.
That is so close.
You have young sailors operating on high alert, communicating over radio channels in different languages, trying to assert dominance without pulling a trigger. It is a high-stakes game of chicken on the open ocean. In those situations, the margin for human error or mechanical failure is razor thin.
And we have a terrifying historical precedent for exactly this kind of disaster. The source material references the 2001 mid-air collision, which is a textbook example of how quickly accidents can spiral into geopolitical crises.
What happened there?
In April 2001, an American United States Navy EP-3 surveillance plane was flying a routine mission near Hainan Island. A Chinese fighter jet flew far too close while attempting to intercept it, and the two aircraft physically collided mid-air.
The results were immediate and tragic.
They were.
The Chinese pilot, Wang Wei, was killed. The heavily damaged American spy plane was forced to make an emergency landing on Chinese soil, and the 24 American crew members were detained by the Chinese military.
It created a massive, incredibly tense diplomatic standoff. It was a crisis produced entirely by a fatal accident, not a planned strategic move.
Right.
And it was only resolved after 11 days of intense, around-the-clock, highly skillful diplomacy where both sides urgently worked to find a way to de-escalate and save face.
And that historical lesson brings us directly to the core argument of Robert S. Ross in his 2026 article, "It is not a Cold War, Competition and Cooperation in United States-China Relations."
What does Ross argue?
Ross acknowledges that the relationship is fraught. He agrees that we are currently in the middle of a massive, transformative global power transition, and that heightened security conflict may be inescapable for the foreseeable future.
Okay.
But he emphatically, urgently argues that we must stop calling this a new Cold War.
I always wonder about this debate over terminology. Like, why does that distinction matter so much? Is it just academic pedantry, or does it have real-world impact? Why shouldn't we just use the Cold War label, since it is easy for the public to understand?
Because in geopolitics, words dictate policy. The frameworks we use shape the tools we reach for.
Right.
Ross argues that if you label the United States-China relationship a Cold War, you automatically adopt Cold War strategies.
Which means what?
You default to a posture of zero-sum containment. You initiate massive, destabilizing military buildups. And most dangerously, you justify a complete cessation of diplomatic dialogue because you view the other side as an existential evil rather than a rational competitor.
That makes sense.
Ross argues that treating this highly interdependent relationship like the Soviet-American Cold War is a fundamentally false and incredibly costly assessment.
And he points out a specific, terrifying consequence of this Cold War mindset taking hold in Washington and Beijing.
Yes, he does.
Because of this intensified strategic competition and the accompanying rhetoric, both countries have systematically gutted their embassy staffing and severely degraded their routine diplomatic communication channels.
It is a shocking degradation of statecraft.
It really is.
Ross notes that embassy officials in both capitals are increasingly idle, not because there isn't work to do, but because the very act of dialogue, of meeting with counterparts to discuss mundane issues, is suddenly deemed politically suspect or even harmful to national security.
That is deeply alarming. Think about the implications of that based on what we just discussed.
Exactly.
If the greatest existential risk of a war between two nuclear-armed superpowers is an accidental collision in the South China Sea, as Zhou suggests, then intentionally cutting off diplomatic communication channels is the absolute worst, most reckless thing you can do.
Without a doubt.
If an American destroyer and a Chinese frigate collide tomorrow morning, and the embassies are hollowed out and the generals aren't authorized to speak to each other, who picks up the red phone to de-escalate the crisis? How do you prevent a misunderstanding from becoming World War III?
You can't. And that is Ross's urgent plea. He argues for the immediate necessity of restoring robust embassy staffing and mandating regular high-level diplomatic consultations, regardless of the broader strategic competition.
Seems like common sense.
It is. Bitter enemies and fierce competitors can build trust, or at least predictability, using imperfect diplomatic tools, but they have to actually talk to each other to use them. Silence breeds paranoia, and paranoia breeds miscalculation.
This intense focus on avoiding miscalculation leads to a fascinating historical ideal that Zhou presents near the end of his introduction. It offers us a rare poetic glimpse into what a successful, fully realized Chinese grand strategy might actually look like to the leadership in Beijing, assuming they successfully wait out the United States.
What is his vision?
He writes that his absolute best hope for his country in the 21st century is that it mirrors the pleasant features of the Tang dynasty.
The Tang dynasty. It is a deeply evocative cultural reference for a Chinese audience, but we should unpack what it represents for our listener.
Let's explore that because it is a beautiful image. The Tang dynasty ran roughly from the 7th to the 10th centuries, and it is widely considered a golden age of cosmopolitan Chinese culture.
Right.
When Zhou looks back at Tang China, he describes an empire that was breathtakingly prosperous, multi-ethnic, highly cosmopolitan, and remarkably inclusive.
Inclusive in what way?
He specifically notes that its capital, Qian'an, was home to foreign religions and cultures ranging from Buddhism and Nestorian Christianity to Zoroastrianism and Islam.
By explicitly invoking the Tang dynasty as the ultimate strategic goal, Zhou is projecting an image of a great power that is undeniably central to the world, a power that is second to none, deeply confident in its own culture, but crucially, a power that is humble and welcoming.
Yes.
He envisions a future China that is loved rather than feared.
That specific phrasing is so important. Loved rather than feared.
It is. It is an intentional, pointed contrast to how Chinese theorists view the concept of Pax Americana today, or Pax Britannica in the 19th century.
How do they view those?
Those Western global orders, in the Chinese view, were maintained through coercive force, vast networks of global military garrisons, and hard power projection.
Right.
Zhou is suggesting that China's ideal global leadership would be based on cultural gravity and economic prosperity, not gunboat diplomacy.
I genuinely marvel at that historical ideal. It is a powerful, highly attractive narrative for both domestic pride and international consumption. It paints a picture of a benevolent giant.
It does.
But I have to push back on this, putting my realist hat back on. Looking at the cold, hard mechanics of the global system we have just spent this entire deep dive discussing, I have to ask, can a superpower ever truly be loved rather than feared in a realist geopolitical system?
It is a fair question. The nature of power is inherently intimidating.
Right. When you have an economy that massive and a modernized military that's capable of projecting force throughout the Indo-Pacific, doesn't fear simply become an unavoidable byproduct of your sheer gravitational pull?
That is a great point.
Let's go back to Thucydides for a second.
Yeah.
Sparta didn't fear Athens because Athens was cartoonishly evil. Sparta feared Athens simply because Athens was growing so large that it threatened the existing balance of power.
Exactly.
The capability itself generates the fear, regardless of the intent.
It is the ultimate paradox of power in international relations.
Yeah.
You can deeply desire to be the welcoming, cosmopolitan center of the world, like Chan during the golden age of the Tang dynasty.
Right.
You can build the wealth, invite the foreign merchants, and preach win-win cooperation. But your neighbors, operating in an anarchic global system where there is no world police to protect them, will always, inevitably, nervously monitor the size of the army guarding your gates.
They have to.
Thucydides and structural realists like Graham Allison would likely argue that a universally loved superpower is an historical anomaly, if not a complete impossibility.
Which leaves us with so much complex reality to process. We have covered an incredible amount of ground today, moving from Marxist theory to fast food supply chains.
We really have.
Let's bring all these threads together and concisely recap this deep dive for our listeners. We started by examining the deeply entrenched ideological view from Beijing, the Chinese Communist Party's Leninist belief in the inevitable structural decline of the United States.
Right.
We saw how this diagnosis of capitalist decay acts as a filter, remaining stubbornly unchanged, regardless of whether the United States is withdrawing from the world stage or actively asserting its military and economic power.
We then contrasted that monolithic elite view with the far more nuanced, pragmatic view from the Chinese public.
Yes.
We highlighted the stabilizing, everyday forces of economic interdependence, shared educational goals, and what you termed fast food diplomacy.
Right.
Turning the mirror around, we looked at the American perspective to see a public deeply anxious about a rapidly rising competitor trapped in the psychological pressures and historical warnings of the Thucydides trap.
From there, we unpacked China's actual observable grand strategy. We discovered that it relies on profound long-term patience, a desire to benefit from the current global economic order rather than violently destroying it, and concerted effort to avoid direct provocation. And finally, we addressed the terrifying reality that despite this long-term patience on both sides, an unexpected accident in the South China Sea, combined with dangerously degraded diplomatic communication channels, could easily spark a catastrophic conflict that neither nation actually wants.
It is a remarkably delicate, precarious balance of perceptions and power. And before we close out this session, I want to leave you, our listener, with a final, unaddressed paradox to ponder on your own.
Okay, let's hear it.
We have established that China's entire grand strategy, its profound geopolitical patience, and its military restraint currently relies on the absolute certainty of structural United States decline. It is baked into their Leninist worldview. They believe time is on their side.
Right. They are patiently sitting in the waiting room, fully expecting the American patient to eventually expire from its own internal contradictions.
But what happens to Beijing's internal stability, its ideological confidence, and its geopolitical patience if the United States simply does not decline? What if the United States, managing its internal threats as Brands and Gaddis recently suggest, manages to heal its political polarization and undergoes a massive, unexpected democratic and economic renaissance?
That is a fascinating scenario.
If that Monty Python doctor in Beijing is suddenly faced with an American patient who is undeniably, vibrantly, and permanently healthy, how does a Chinese system built entirely on the premise of outlasting a dying empire adapt to a revitalized one?
Right.
Does their strategic patience hold, or does a renewed, healthy United States force a dangerous, sudden recalculation in Beijing?
That is the multi-trillion-dollar question, and it is the perfect place to leave our exploration today. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive.
Thanks for listening.
The geopolitical waters between Washington and Beijing are incredibly murky, full of contradictory signals and ideological blind spots. But the more we understand the underlying currents, the historical fears, and the complex perceptions actively driving both actors, the better equipped we are to navigate what comes next. Keep questioning the simple narrative you read in the daily headlines. Look past the surface-level X-rays, and we will see you on the next deep dive.